Hello and welcome to The Information, where you'll get all the information on the latest in electronic, indie pop, experimental music, and more. Today we have another installment of my review roundup I call Info Dump, where I review a series of albums that have all come out in the past few months in a somewhat informal fashion. I just want to get my thoughts out on these records, whether they were good or bad or somewhere in between. But anyways, let's kick things off with the latest Beirut record, Gallipoli. And for those unfamiliar, Beirut is a band that is helmed and pretty much spearheaded solely by Zach Condon. He's from New Mexico and traffics somewhere between indie pop and world music, with a good heaping helping of folk thrown in as well. I want to say this is his fifth record right now, preceding 2015's No No No, which was a very prophetically titled album. It's not terrible, but it's definitely his weakest effort for sure. And while this new record, Gallipoli, is definitely a better album than people are claiming it to be, I also don't think it's anything like a career renaissance exactly for Condon, but it's definitely hardly the abysmal career low that I've seen critics and other reviewers paint this album as. That being said, I definitely agree that the album does not start off strong at all. Pretty much the first four tracks you get here, including one of the first singles, they all suffer from a very tacked on, sort of vintage, semi-lo-fi recording quality that particularly ends up affecting the vocals, which end up sounding super distorted or like they've been lifted off some like 80-year-old warped gramophone or something. Where this record truly starts to shine is in the middle section though, especially on the fifth track here, Giardini. It blossoms into a gorgeous, semi-experimental piece of piano-backed Baroque pop. I like the old-timey organs that sort of chirp away in the background. There's some stately piano chords, and I like at the 1:15 mark in the song, it introduces a warm bass and some nostalgic vocal melodies. Around this section you also get some nice textures with a rising wash of white noise, which really fills the mix and makes it nice and thick underneath some clattering drums. The equally majestic following track, Gauze for Za, which I'm probably mispronouncing. It features a fun and jaunty groove, a trilling bass line, and some expertly layered oohs and ahs during the chorus. It's a song, speaking of that fun, jaunty vibe, it gives me vibes of like a seafaring band of pirates going on wacky misadventures or something. The last half of this 6-minute tune is basically an ambient piece that follows the same kind of chord progression as the traditional first half of the song. I do think the instrumentation here is kind of too subtle and unremarkable during this ambient passage for it to be really as engaging or as memorable as the first half of the track, but at the same time it didn't hinder my enjoyment of the track as a whole. Corfu, the next track, is a surprising instrumental cut, and it gave me very specific similarities to like other acts like King Cruel in its moody chord progression, as well as the French band Air, especially the piano-driven tunes on their album Pocket Symphony like Mayfair Song or Mer du Japon. It's a little Balearic and a little more bossa nova, and overall it's pretty impressive and a track that I can easily see soundtracking swanky cocktail parties in the future. This track is followed up by Landslide, one of the early singles off the record, and it follows Zach's more poppy instincts. I feel like in a sense it's pretty much just like a reiteration of every Beirut single from his last two records, reminiscent specifically of the tracks Santa Fe or like No No No, the title track to that record. It's pretty much built around a chord progression with some nice sunny organ chords that sound very nice and vintage. Besides the vague unoriginality of the track, what irks me about this one here particularly is the overlong use of the wordless "oh I" that occupies the last minute and a half of the song. It literally sounds like Zach is stuck in a musical loop and he doesn't know how to like resolve this or like get out of this section of the song. The rest of the song is fine, it's just I wish that he would have been able to like end this section off a little bit sooner so it doesn't kind of drive you mad a little bit. To me, the last good song on this record is Family Curse, which does appear towards the end. It's got a very soft, loungy drum machine beat, and there's also a nice warm organ drone in the first half. The vocal melodies during this first part as well, and the whole song really are just super fantastic, and they all resolve very nicely. I also like the brass leads here, they're quite effective. And from the minute 40 section on, we get this burst into life with bright organs, airy uplifting strings and horns, and absolutely breathtaking chord progressions. There's a huge sense of adventure that this section gives off. It's truly palpable, and Zach was smart to let the instrumental section here play out until the end. Sadly, the magic of this record kind of burns out at the end here with the last few tracks, Light in the Atoll and We Never Lived Here. I feel like they don't live up to the magic of that middle section, like I said. There's some meandering brass melodies and plotting tempos. It's all just kind of too slow and forgettable, ultimately. I thought the outro track, Finn, was kind of an okay way to end the album off, with some spiraling synth arpeggios and some wordless coups from Zach Condon. This track in particular sounds much more contemporary sounding than any track he's done in quite a while. It almost sounds like it could have been one of the interludes off the last M83 record, Junk. But overall, like I said, it's not like Beirut is back, baby, you know, in like big, bold capital letters. It's pretty nice. It's definitely not an awful album at all. It's pretty enjoyable, especially if you just listen to like the middle 5 or 6 songs on the record. And speaking of 6, that's probably what I would give this thing, a decent 6. That sounds good to me. Up next, I wanted to talk about a record that I was surprised was getting as much coverage as it was, and more importantly, surprised that it was getting as much positive coverage as it was, and that is the Default Genders record, Main Pop Girl 2019. Now, this record was a surprise release to me, and basically anybody else besides the person who made this, James Brooks, who was formerly one half of the Minnesota synth pop and sort of J-pop leaning shoegaze outfit Elite Gymnastics. And if you haven't heard his previous record, which is also his first under the Default Genders name, Magical Pessimism 2014, you truly need to go check that out. It is a fantastic record, and in many ways is a direct continuation of the sounds that Elite Gymnastics was making before their hiatus and eventual breakup. Now, this new record here, Main Pop Girl 2019, was dropped after the Super Bowl ended with literally no fanfare at all. I just checked YouTube and it said that James Brooks uploaded this entire record, and I just like had to do like a triple take basically, because it was, as you can kind of tell by the title, it had been 5 years since the last record, and more importantly, one that I was definitely looking forward to. But sadly, the hype waned with each subsequent track that I listened to on this record. Now, I can safely say that the album is bookended by its 2 best songs, easily. Kicking things off with When It's Over, featuring No Rome on vocals. While I do enjoy the sound and the overall delivery of No Rome's vocals, they sadly are mixed quite low, and they're also coded and really just slathered in auto-tune. And if not auto-tune, at least some sort of weird vocal processor. Though I will say the instrumental palette that's built around his voice is much more impressive. It's got some airy synth pads, and it's chock full of groovy vintage drum breaks with a little bit of reverb on there as well. It's an instrumental palette that definitely gets repeated a lot across the record. I also like the breakdown section of this particular song quite a lot. It's nice and dreamy. The rest of the record unfortunately gets bogged down due to its production, or I guess lack thereof. There is a huge mixing issue across this album, and all of the vocals are processed so heavily and mixed so laughably low, not to mention pitched up so high or so low to the point of making the vocals completely unrecognizable and sounding completely alien, which I guess may very well have been the point, but more importantly, it just doesn't sound good. And speaking of his vocals, it's also very strange and borderline lazy, I think, how many times I heard a vocal take come in mid-breath rather than cutting out that part entirely, or at least including the full breath. The fact that Brooks chose to do neither and kind of pick the lazy middle ground made me kind of irrationally annoyed, and it distracted me from enjoying a lot of the songs. Also, the middle chunk of this record is not my favorite at all. It's pretty much 160 to 190 BPM nightcore edits. Like, legitimately, there's an honest-to-goodness cover of Holy Ground by Taylor Swift with, like, breakbeats that are breakneck speeds. To be fair, that does give you an idea of the sound and aesthetic of this record as a whole. I also found on here a very unnecessary, I guess, remix or redo of his own song Sophie, which appeared on his Magical Pessimism 2014 record. The lyrics are pretty much exactly the same, but everything about it that was kind of reconstructed is just worse in every conceivable way. There's clunkier grooves, and the production is inferior somehow to the one that was made 5 years before. I'm not really sure how that happened, but if I had to pick one song that wasn't the first or last song that I enjoyed, it would have to be A Christmas Card from a Scammer in Minneapolis. I loved its wintry pads, its down-tempo breakbeats, and charming lyrics about themes of poverty and teenage rebellion, as well as commenting on the amusingly sad local celebrity culture of Brooks's hometown of Minneapolis. And speaking of the last song on the record, the outro track here, Checking In with the Old Gang, this is a sweet slice of hyperpop with urgent up-tempo breaks and floating pads. The vocal melodies, particularly on the chorus, are emotionally resonant and very catchy to boot, with Brooks lamenting that reuniting with old friends and old flames alike generally isn't so amazing as it might have seemed at the time. It's definitely a song whose lyrical content I found to be pretty relatable, which sadly I can't say the rest of the album achieves, despite the almost poetic hyper-specificity of the lyrics the majority of the time on this record. Also, the clunky vocal delivery across the record, trying to cram in as many words as possible into a line, sometimes spilling it over into the next line, further detracts from the enjoyment I would have gotten out of this record. Overall, this could have used a lot more polish, especially for a record that took 5 years to make. It's kind of indefensible, the shoddy production and mixing here, as I've talked about before. So ultimately, this is a pretty disappointing sophomore follow-up to one of my favorite records of 2014, and one that I had a lot of hopes for, sadly. I'd have to give this thing a light to decent 4. Speaking of disappointing, let's talk about the new Maggie Rogers record, Heard It in a Past Life. This album is indie darling Maggie Rogers' debut record, came out back in late January, and after the viral success of her Pharrell-approved single Alaska, this album suffers from the growing pains of an artist and many artists who kind of make that leap into the big leagues, namely with vocal melodies that are either unmemorable or kind of monotone. Just generally, I feel like the vocal melodies are kind of too soaring for Rogers, usually quaint, very quirky alt-pop rasp she normally has. Though I will say some of the more experimental tracks on this record do kind of rely on sounds and instruments that are normally outside of Rogers' wheelhouse, which actually does them more favors, because if nothing else they do kind of stick out because of that. In general, this album kind of settles into a faint recollection of like a mishmash of Fleetwood Mac or Haim or something like that, and just generally that trove of overproduced pop records that like to sprinkle in light funk elements, arena rock destined drum fills, and vaguely fun rhythm guitar, and summery yet indistinct synths. The opener here, Give a Little, is a track that suffers from a too samey vocal melody that I was mentioning before, especially during the verses, though the spunky tropical flair of the chorus is quite nice on the ears. I also thought The Knife was one of the early highlights that works more by being more of an outlier with its metallic percussion, super chunky bass line, and flourishes of piano in the second half. Her big viral single Alaska is obviously included here, as it's the one that everyone got introduced to her with, and to be fair, it sounds just as good and charming and fun as it did on the EP that preceded this record. Light On is another single that tries to merge Rogers' folksier roots with the supersized inspirational arena rock choruses that artists that she opens for usually traffic in, a la Mumford & Sons. Ultimately, I feel pretty neutral about it, though the vocal delivery of the line "You Should Be So Happy Now" before the second chorus is pretty sweet. Also, the piano ballad Past Life that is about halfway through the record here, it borrows super heavily in places from Fleetwood Mac's Dreams especially, and has Rogers straining vocally when she isn't borrowing from them. The track Say It is probably my favorite one off the record, if only again for how much it sticks out with its slick hip-hop instrumental and smooth droning synth pad in the background. I also like the spinning arpeggios in the song, but if anything the vocal melodies still do kind of suffer occasionally from the sameness. To be fair, the chorus is kind of catchy even with its The tune On Off was another one that was pulled from her EP Now That the Light Is Fading, and it's anchored by some textured percussion, oscillating piano keys, and chopped up funky bass. I thought Falling Water, again I think it was one of the singles here. Basically the singles were just not very good. Very vague, very kind of boilerplate indie pop. Yeah, I just thought it suffered from super lackluster production here, most notably with the terrible snares during the verses and the overbearing toms in the slowed down last minute or so. And the track Retrograde basically sounds like every Gold Room song ever made, but with irritatingly sour guitars wailing away during the chorus. Ultimately, there are just too many points on this record where it doesn't feel like this was made by Maggie herself. I mean, obviously it wasn't, there were a lot of other producers and guest writers and stuff. The production is super hi-fi, super glossy, super expensive sounding, and doesn't seem like a natural progression where she was working with on early tracks like Alaska and even her folksier stuff before that. It just reeks of being really calculated and really safe, and kind of like, instrumentally speaking, a placeholder album for like another vocalist in case Maggie couldn't show up or something. This gets like a strong 4 to a light 5 to me. And last but not least, I wanted to mention the Panda Bear record, Buoys. I've seen a lot of people talking about this one. For those unfamiliar, Panda Bear is one of the founding members of acclaimed psych, folk, and pop outfit Animal Collective. He's been putting out solo albums since about the early 2000s, his most famous one of which is Person Pitch, which is a super fun collage of animal sounds and fireworks and people crying and jungle noises, and it's just basically a very fun listen. If you haven't heard any Panda Bear records or songs, definitely go check out Person Pitch. That's a great starting point. But Buoys here, this is his 6th full length under the Panda Bear name, and it's also just so happens to be the worst record I have heard in the past half decade. If I was Anthony Fantano, I would be doing a not good section on this right now. To kind of break this record down, let's talk about the first track, which was the lead single up to this record, Dolphin. This song would be the first song in a YouTube playlist titled How Long Can You Make It Before Closing This Tab. There's super ineffective vocal deliveries from Lennox and a maddening waterboard reminiscent water drip sound effect that happens throughout the entirety of this song. It makes it feel like it goes on for double the 4-minute runtime, which is already 2 minutes too long for this song. There is almost a complete abandonment of basic musical elements like melodic progression, discernible transitions from verse to chorus, or adding new elements to a song to keep things from getting stale. Lennox decides to spit in the face of conventional wisdom yet again on the next track, Cranked, which is little more than an exact replica of Dolphin, featuring the same rudimentary acoustic guitar loop that gets old after 10 seconds, the same snail's pace tempo, the same annoying sound effects, with cheap-sounding phasers shooting into the listener's ear like a pencil. The difference between the first track, Dolphin, and this track here, Crank, is that Noah puts a delay on his vocals here. That's it. It doesn't help anything. It's still bad. At this point, I would love to talk about the next track, Token, but I literally don't want to, both because I would risk repeating myself, and because the lyrical dissection of this track in particular could fill its own entire video. Lennox talks, I think, about blowing off steam with, quote, a blast from an automatic, smooth, no jamming, a slap on a jelly ass. This is not something I ever wanted to hear Noah sing about, if he is indeed singing about the literal interpretation of what I think he's singing about, and not some usually cryptic metaphor that he always puts in his songs with no context that will never be found. The instrumental chorus is nice, I guess. I mean, after all, it was one of the singles to this record. There are some synth effects in it that ascend almost seemingly infinitely, but I can't even enjoy that part, because last year, he put out a song called Shepherd Tone on an EP that I reviewed on this channel, A Day with the Homies, which is an auditory illusion that sounds like the chords are infinitely ascending. This record is like such a travesty that he can't even title his songs correctly. This one here, that would have been the song he would have called Shepherd Tone, but he already made a song called Shepherd Tone last year, and it doesn't even have the Shepherd Tone in it, so like, he can't even do that right. Unfortunately, Panda's insistence on making this an extremely cohesive record also means subjecting the listener to more sloppily looped one-bar acoustic snippets with usually one single hi-hat section, horribly annoying sound effects, terribly cheap vocal processing, which you can actually literally hear the vocal artifacts on, like they're that bad and they're that cheap. It also means Buoys is a pretty polarizing record, if you can't already tell by my hatred of it. If you love the first song on this record, you will love the rest of the record. If you hate the first song on this record, you will want to claw your eyes out. Like the whining feedback of I Know I Don't Know, the horribly mixed blasts of white noise on the title track, the terribly unsettling crying girl sample, and equally disconcerting nightmare fuel vocal layering on Inner Monologue. I could go on. It's just the overall stiffness, unpleasantness, and melodic laziness of this album. It's bewildering, coming from a guy who has made some of my favorite records and songs, and especially someone who is part of one of the most influential and successful psych pop bands and indie folk outfits of all time, Animal Collective. I am very familiar with his repetitive nature of his melodies and samples and vocals and stuff, but those melodies in particular, like on Bros and Good Girl Carrots and stuff like that, and Slow Motion, those are rich and textured and inspiring and engaging, and the vocal melodies are actually like good and interesting. But with the minimal, borderline skeletal instrumental approach of Buoys, the individual elements that were usually fun window dressing are now front and center, and it doesn't work as well. They have a way tougher time standing on their own, just kind of nervously rooted in the ground like a sweaty nerd at the 8th grade dance or something. I've said all I've needed to say about this record. If you like the new Panda record, Buoys, good for you. I'm really happy for you. I hate it. I'm giving this thing a strong 1, maybe a light 2. I like the last song on the record. It's fine. It's the least annoying one, but it's still not good. And that's kind of where I want to end this video too. Let me know if you have heard any of the records I reviewed today. Let me know if you liked any of the records or disliked any of the records. Definitely let me know if you disliked the Panda Bear record, Buoys, so we can talk shit about it in the comments. I'd love to do that. Hope you guys have a great day, and thank you again for watching The Information.